Hello, this is Dr. David Bilstrom, and we have a spectacular question here to discuss today. So the question is, why are women 80% of all the people that get an autoimmune disease? Great question. Now, we've talked about estrogen dominance before. That's one of the big ones, but now we're going to talk about the X chromosome, okay? So women have two copies of the X chromosome, every cell in their body. Men have one X, one Y. For a woman to be optimally healthy, she has to shut down over 85% of the entire second X chromosome, almost shut down an entire chromosome in every cell in her body because there's so many bad genes on the X chromosome that have to be silenced. Okay. Now, the body is super cool how it compensates for stuff, right? We always talk about the body is super, super complicated. It is super, super logical. But what we're going to do is we're going to put together this X chromosome issue with chronic infections. Okay, so you remember, we now know chronic infections are part of every chronic disease, not just autoimmune disease. All right, but these infections really take advantage of the compensatory mechanisms that the body is using to try to stay healthy, particularly when it comes in women and the second X chromosome. So in your cells, you have the nucleus and it's surrounded by the cytoplasm outside the nucleus. Well, inside the nucleus is where our genetic material is, the nuclear genetic material, and the X chromosome. Okay, so here you have all these chromosomes. There's good ones and not so good ones like the X chromosome. So what the nucleus does is, because these X chromosomes are so problematic, it kind of shoves the X chromosomes to the periphery of the nucleus, kind of moving it away from where a lot of the action is. Okay, it's just going to kind of mess things up. So we're going to slide it to the outside of the nucleus. Well, also on the outside of the nucleus is something called the nucleolus. Now, this is basically a huge production plant. Okay, it makes stuff. Okay, what it makes is proteins. These are really important proteins that we need. Okay, but you can kind of think of it like, here you got this big production plant, right? Manufacturing plant. Well, manufacturing plants inherently, kind of create toxic, stuff. And so the nucleolus is shoved to the periphery because it kind of creates a lot of toxic stuff as it's trying to make all these really cool proteins that we need, right? Let's move it to the side, kind of, you don't want your major manufacturing plant right in the middle of your downtown, right next to the coffee shop and, all this. You kind of move it to the outside of the city, right? Kind of on the periphery of it. But then here's this X chromosome and nucleolus kind of sitting on the outside together. Okay. But here's infections. Okay. So let's say Epstein-Barr virus, for example, or the other infections that drive chronic disease. So here's this bug that gets into us. Okay. It's going to try to make us sick. So it's going to try to make our body make proteins from the genetic material within the virus, right? And if we make proteins that's coded by the viral genome, it's going to make us sick. All these proteins get made, right? And it's making us sick. And the virus wants to make copies of itself. So it's trying to get our mechanisms to make copies of its genes so it can make more copies and more proteins to make us feel sick, right? Well, if the virus that gets into our system is going to go and try to make copies of itself and make proteins from its genetic material, where is it going to go? It's going to go to the manufacturing plant, right? That's where all the proteins are made based on genes. So it gets into the nucleolus and tries to get the nucleolus to make copies of itself and its own genome. Well, when viruses get into the power plant, this manufacturing plant, it wants this big manufacturing plant as it can possibly get to make more copies of itself. So it causes the nucleolus to start getting bigger, 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 so it can make more copies of this virus, right? Well, what happens is when this nucleolus grows, it actually engulfs part of the X chromosome that's sitting right next to it. So now all these bad genes in the X chromosome are within the manufacturing plant, and we start making copies of the X chromosome. And then the X chromosome starts making all these bad proteins coded by the genes. Oh my gosh, this X chromosome now that we're hiding in the periphery of the cell is actually engulfed, and we're making tons and tons and tons of copies of this of the genetic material in the X chromosome and the proteins that it codes for to make us feel terribly sick. And This is why women's health is so much more challenging. But how do we prevent that kind of stuff? How do we prevent all that stuff from happening? The engulfing of the X chromosome, the chromosome getting read, all this kind of stuff, and then all these proteins that are in the nucleus from getting out into the cytoplasm where they shouldn't be, and those proteins outside of where they should be. Here comes the immune system going, hey, I need to investigate these. There's proteins that are messing us up. Starts autoimmune processes, attacking those proteins and all this kind of stuff. Well, methylation reactions. Okay, these really important methylation reactions keep all this stuff from happening. So if we're deficient in methyl groups, we're not eating our cruciferous vegetables that have all these methyl groups. We're not using methylated B vitamins when we need them. We don't have trimethylglycine, the great methyl donor within our fully methylated activated B complex. We're going to find it very challenging to methylate all this stuff going on in the periphery of the nucleus and prevent autoimmune disease in women because of this darn X chromosome thing. So these methylation reactions, uber important at preventing all this kind of stuff from happening. Great question. Thank you so much.